Now that we've got our scene looking pretty good, we've got visible light set up, we've got some noise in here, the highlights are looking pretty cool. Let's go ahead and think about the particles that are flying around his head, and we'll get our camera motion in place and start getting ready to do some final tweaks before we render our piece out. And so let's go ahead and do that particle simulation. It's not actually particles, but we'll call them floaty particles. And to create that, I'm actually going to use Mograph. So in my main view here, I'm just going to stop looking at my camera, and I'm going to go ahead and create a Mograph cloner. And I'm going to put that cloner near the light. And what I want to do is generate sort of a sphere or area of reflective tiny particles that exist around this area, so that in the render they're going to show up right in here, but not so much down here in these dark areas. I don't want them to show up down there. I just want them to be mainly around this light, so it feels like light's coming down and highlighting some dust particles. And so to do that, we are going to clone just a polygon. So I'm going to go into my shape or my primitive menu and create a polygon. And that's going to create a big rectangle down here at first. I'm going to tell it to be a triangle. And I'm going to tell it to be tiny. I won't make it too tiny at the start. I'm just going to say 2 centimeters. And then I'm going to drag that polygon into my cloner. And now that cloner is creating duplicates of that polygon. And if I move around in my scene, you can see that it is indeed creating some polygons. And right now it's creating 3 of them. There they are. So it's creating 3 polygons. And they're not very close together. They're really far apart. So let's go ahead and change the way it's creating them. So I'm going to change this down to grid array. And so now it's creating 3 of them in the X dimension, 1 in the Y, and 3 in the Z. We're going to tell it to create about 6 in each one of these dimensions. I'm going to change the mode here from per step to endpoint. And I'm going to change that endpoint down to about 200. Why am I choosing that number? Because I know that when I was selecting the fall-off radius for my lights, I used 500 at the beginning. So that gives me a rough understanding of how big this area is. If I really wanted to know exactly, I could select one of my lights, like the smaller one, look at the visibility, and see what my outer distance is. It's only 100, right? It's about 100 for the outer distance. So that's that area right there. And that's 100, is that, yeah, so it's roughly 100. So that tells me a 1000 size endpoint for my grid array is going to be really big. So let's just try 200 for each. And now you can see those coming in a lot more closely. And indeed, that is still too big, I think. So I'm going to go ahead and set it up about the same as my light, 100. And so we're creating 6 of these in all of these dimensions. We've got this grid array of little triangular objects in space. And that's not going to do much for us right now. It's going to feel a little odd. I mean, it's kind of cool looking, but it's not what we want. So let's go ahead and get these to move around the way that we want them to and be the size that we want them to. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a random effector, and that's going to move these around randomly. So I'm going to make sure my cloner is selected, and this is very important. It's important that you have the cloner actually selected. Go into your Mograph menu, effector, and make a random effector. When you do that, because it's selected, it automatically applies it to the cloner object. And just to double check, I'm going to go into my effectors and I can see, yep, there it is. So let's see what this random effector does. In the parameters section, we can see an X, Y, and Z dimension that it's randomizing the position for. So if we change that, they're going to be farther or closer in those dimensions. And I usually like to use just the default there is fine for this particular need. It's just scattering them about so it doesn't feel like they're on a perfect grid. I'm not going to turn on scale, but I am going to turn on rotation. Rotation, I'm going to say 360 degrees in every dimension. So they're going to randomly rotate 360 degrees in every direction. So now it feels like this sort of scattered group of triangles. The next thing I'm going to do is create another random effector. So the cloner is selected, going into Mograph, effector, random. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave the settings the way they are again for position. I'm going to change rotation, and I'm going to set it to 360 again in every dimension. This seems kind of redundant, but you'll see why in a moment. And what I want to do is make one very specific change here. And under effector, I'm going to change the way this is affecting from being random to using noise. And when you do that, immediately we have now the ability to have animation and scale change for this noise that's being generated in space. And so if I hit play now, you can see that these particles are just kind of moving around in space, and that's because of this animation speed, and it's because of the strength and the scale that we're setting this on. If I change the scale down to something like 50, they're going to move a little faster and closer together, like little bugs buzzing around or something like that. If I change the animation speed down to half, it's going to move half as fast. I'm going to change it down to 1, because I just want them to kind of be floating, maybe 2. I just kind of want them to be like floating little dust particles that are rotating and floating through space. They're very gentle and moving very slowly. And I'm going to go up here and look in this view so I can see what's happening with my actual scene. Now obviously these are huge. So let's pause, let it render, and see what's going on. So we're getting these huge triangles rendering. Now I made them big right now because I wanted to be able to see them so I know what's going to happen. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and scale them down the size I want them to be. And I'm going to make them maybe 0.2. And so now they really are just little dust specks. And let's go ahead and look through our camera and select this viewport, hit Command R, and we'll do a preview render so we see what we're getting. And so you can see those little dust specks now floating around. I want to give these guys a material so that all that they do is reflect the things around them. And to do that, I want to create a new material. It'll be a PBR material as well. In that material, I'm going to go into my default diffuse, delete it, default reflection, delete it, and I'm going to add my own Beckman, and that is it. That's all I'm going to do, and close it. And this material I'm going to drag onto the polygon. And then you'll see in the view here, it has made most of them disappear. And that's great, because what's going to happen is we're going to get that little glint of reflection only when that triangle particle, like these over here, are aligned perfectly to bounce the light into our camera's lens. And so that will make it feel like dust, and there'll be black little spots when they're not being reflected. Now they are showing up, and if I go ahead and do a Command R render again, they are actually showing up all over my scene. So you can see some down here, there's one here and here, they're out here. They're not being isolated to this sort of sphere around his head, which is what I want. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to create another cloner effector, and this one's going to be a plane effector. So I've selected my cloner. I'm going up to Mograph, Effectors, Plane, and in the Plane effector, I'm going to set a parameter for scale only. So I'm going to uncheck position. I'm going to check scale. I'm going to check uniform scale. So this allows me just to move one thing. And what I want to do is increase the scale. So I'm going to make them bigger. Why would I make them bigger when I just made them smaller? I'm working back and forth kind of this way because it allows me to see what I'm doing without having to guess so much. And so guess what I'm going to do now? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to scale these down even more. So I'm going to do 0.02. 0.02. What that does is it makes them almost completely invisible and tiny little nothings out here. It makes them almost invisible tiny little nothings, really. I have to come back and scale this up even more in my plane effector to make them visible. So I'm going to scale them up until they look the way I want them to look all the time. So I'm getting some that are floating around in here. They'll show up. And now I'm going to make the ones outside of the sphere disappear. And the way we'll do that is using fall off. And fall off now in Cinema 4D has all of these fields that you can use. It's a very nice feature. I'm going to use spherical fall off. Spherical fall off gives me a sphere, and basically what's going to happen is this effector only works inside of this sphere, and there is a center portion and there's an outer portion. Let's turn off these lights so we can see that. We can just turn off the visibility of the light in the editor. And now we can actually see that field really clearly. And so that field's scale and position is going to determine how big and where these particles are. So if I scale this down a little bit, now the particles are only going to be existing biggest inside this center sphere and then smaller outside there. Let's go ahead and move it down a little bit more. So biggest around his head, smallest to nothing outside here. If I feel like they're not showing up enough, which is kind of how I feel right now, I can come into this plane effector again, and I can come into the parameter and go ahead and increase that scale some more. And now I'm seeing these particles around his head that are sort of just bouncing around, and it feels like little dust specks, but out here, nothing's happening. That is exactly what I was looking for. So it's a little bit complicated, it takes some time to set up, but once you get used to using the cloner and doing things like this, you'll be putting dust particles on all of your work. Let's do a couple test renders. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I mean, I see some out here. That's nice. I don't see that many down here. I feel like that lighting's pretty cool. I'm liking the way it looks. I think the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and just set up my camera motion. And so we'll go ahead and look through the camera, come down to 90 frames, and I'm just going to, actually I'm going to reframe this one a tad. So I'm going to be on frame 0, reposition my camera down. I just want his head a little bit lower. Yeah, I like the way that I can see more of that light coming down, and he's not quite as prominent. I might rotate around just a little bit too. Trying to get a view alike. I don't want it to feel like he's actually looking at a phone. No, I'm going to stick with my original view. So something like this. And I'm going to say that's good enough, and we're going to keyframe that position. Go ahead and move to the end of our, we're just going to do a 3-second video. And I'm going to click close to the top of his head and zoom in just a little bit. I don't want it to be too crazy. I want this to be a little subtle. Push in. And make sure my camera's selected, keyframe that. I'll go ahead and play it through. Now right now it's easing in and it's easing out and stopping at the end. I kind of don't like that for this view. I think what I want to do instead is have just a linear push camera motion. So I'm going to come in here to my camera. I'm going to right click and say show tracks. So sorry, I think they moved it down. So show tracks, and these are already selected. I'm just going to click linear, and that'll change it from being a ease in, ease out to a completely linear push in. So now when I play my screen here, you'll see that it's not easing in anymore. It's just simply pushing in, and then it's stopping at the end and looping over and over. Because I have to constantly manipulate and change things, I'm actually gonna do one more change, just refining things a little bit. I'm gonna make this pushed in quite a bit more. Yeah, I like that. And I'm gonna push in again here. It'll stay linear. I'm being aware of my little horizon line motion. I'm not super happy with that, so I'm going to go ahead and, in this frame, pull it up a little more. Yeah, that feels good. So I want it to be just like this push in straight to the sort of the back of his head. And so we'll see what that motion looks like. After we've seen what that motion looks like, I'm going to come up here, check a couple of my frames and see how they are looking. I'm looking for particle motion. I'm looking for the highlights of my lens, on the top of the head. I'm looking for how the lights are looking. And so what I think I want to do is get more of a rim light on this top guy. So I'm actually going to go ahead and zoom out a little and sort of real time move him so I get what I'm looking for, and it'll help if I can actually see that light. Let's push it forward. And let's rotate it. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so I think I'm pretty happy with the way the light looks. I'm pretty happy with the visible lights. And from here, we're going to go ahead and just get our render set up and move into some post effects. So in the next segment, I'm going to set up the render settings for you and show you how to get that rendered out. And then we'll go ahead and jump into After Effects.